Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today on Level Up Law. We're here at South Carolina Legal Services. We are leveling up your legal knowledge on the different areas of law that we practice in. I'm Susan Ingalls, Senior Staff Attorney with South Carolina Legal Services, and I'm joined today by Tiffany Love, who's our lead attorney for barriers to employment. Today we will be providing some basic information about bylaws for small businesses and nonprofits. Just a reminder that next week, our veterans attorney, Corey Strain, will be on Level Up Law, and he'll be discussing some of the latest information on your rights as a veteran. So we are recording today's episode. It will be posted on our YouTube channel later this week, where we post all of our Level Up Law presentations and the slides as well. Of course, during the presentation, we will have you in listen-only mode, but at the conclusion, as time permits, we will be answering questions. So we do invite you to put questions in the question box here on your screen. And do keep in mind, this is not legal advice. It's just a presentation of general information for the public. You should always consult an attorney, especially when it comes to corporate matters and bylaws. It's always important to have an attorney on board to help you out. We won't be able to answer any specific questions specific to your particular situation, but at the conclusion of today's webinar, we will have the contact information for South Carolina Legal Services so that you can apply for our services to see if you are eligible. So again, thanks so much for joining us, and let's get started. Tiffany?
All right, so good afternoon. Like Susie said, my name is Tiffany Love, and we're going to be talking about the basics of bylaws today. So the purpose of this webinar is to provide general information only regarding the construction of your bylaws, and the information provided, as Susie mentioned, is not to be construed as legal advice. If you would like specific advice or suggestions for your bylaw, you can apply for our services, and the contact information is going to be on our last slide. And if you are a nonprofit or you are starting a nonprofit, then you should always start with consulting the South Carolina Nonprofit Act. Okay, so we're going to be talking about today, why are bylaws important? How do you create your bylaws? How to maintain your bylaws? And again, this is not a comprehensive review. This is just an overview of bylaws and nonprofits in general. So South Carolina Legal Services provides services to nonprofits and small businesses. Attorneys here may provide eligible individuals or groups with assistance with drafting their bylaws, reviewing your governing documents if you already have them, understanding the differences and advantages between nonprofits and fiscal sponsorships. For instance, do you need a nonprofit, or should you be under the umbrella of another established 501c3? We assist with filing with tax exemption statuses and also just advising small businesses on legal matters. So what are bylaws? Bylaws are those internal governing documents that are essentially the roadmap to your organization. The South Carolina Nonprofit Act, as you can see on your screen, defines it as the code or codes of rules other than the articles adopted pursuant to this chapter for the regulation or management of the affairs of the corporation, irrespective of the name or names by which the rules are designated. And then it goes on further to say, the incorporations or board of directors of a corporation shall adopt bylaws for the corporation. The bylaws may contain any provision for regulating and managing the affairs of the corporation that is not inconsistent with the law or articles of incorporation. So why are bylaws important? For one, it's going to tell you how to handle significant events in the operations of your corporation. You want to be able to look to your bylaws for guidance on handling the day-to-day operations of your corporation. If something goes wrong, again, you need to be able to look back to those bylaws that you drafted for guidance. And if, say, your corporation decides to dissolve or discontinue, you need to go back to your bylaws to see how you're going to wind that down. So back to the South Carolina Nonprofit Act, as it pertains to bylaws, the word bylaws actually appears in the Act 162 times. So it's pretty important factor of your corporation. The word must 136 and the word shall 145 times. So sometimes that act provisions are requirements, but it also gives you the discretion, and it can just be a default rule if your bylaws don't cover a matter or if the bylaws cannot overrule a particular law. So for instance, the example below, which are quorum requirements, just for instance, I'll go through section A, which is unless this chapter, the article, or bylaws provide for a higher or lower quorum, 10% of the votes entitled to be cast on a matter must be presented at a meeting of members to constitute a quorum on that matter. So it gives you discretion. However, if you don't have this information in your bylaws, you must result back to the South Carolina Nonprofit Act. You can advance to the next slide. When drafting your bylaws, you want to keep in mind that if you fail to comply with them, there may be severe consequences to your organization or the members of your organization. So that can be where decisions that can't be ratified by the board, it could constitute a breach of fiduciary duties. There may be potential shareholder derivative suits, and it could even result in the loss of indemnification. And just kind of connected to that, common bylaw problems are, for many, when people draft their bylaws, they tend to just put them to the side and that they're forgotten documents. Your board members are not familiar with the rules. They're not referred to when you make important decisions for your nonprofit. So oftentimes people are acting against what they actually drafted, initially starting the organization. They may include too many rules or not enough, and they are often not reviewed and updated. Again, sometimes people just push them to the side after creating them. So what should your bylaws include? A few things, but the statement of your lawful purpose. You want to include your official office, the provisions of the officers and directors of the corporation. If it's a membership organization, you want to include provisions that also govern the members, administrative and financial provisions. You want the procedure for amendments if you need to make changes to your bylaws. But you do want to always consult that act and see how you should set up your bylaws when drafting or amending or taking action. So sometimes you don't have to start from scratch. The act kind of lays it out for you what you should do. So a few documents that are going to be helpful to have available when you are creating or reviewing your bylaws are those articles of incorporation that you need. You want to make sure that they don't conflict. The Act provides provisions that must and may be included in the articles, so that should already be there for you. You want to have the South Carolina Nonprofit Act available. Again, that code, South Carolina Code 33-31-101. You want to have that IRS Form 1023 in the Form 990 available to you. And you want to have these things available to make sure that bylaws have any, you have any required suggested or provisions or ones that they may ask about. So that's significant to your organization. So it's important to have all of these documents available beside you. I think Susie's taking over.
I sure can. So ultimately, these are just the basic categories that your bylaws are going to address that we have here on the screen. There's a lot of details to think about. And it's important that you think about how you are going to want your corporation to operate. You know, quite often we find that people will just say, oh, let me just have a form of bylaws and we'll just go by that. And, you know, sometimes that can be okay, but you really need to review those and think about what you're going to be doing as a small business or nonprofit, and think about, does this really cover everything that it needs to cover for you? You know, anything from who's in charge to, you know, whether or not you're going to have members, will you have committees to do work, and that sort of thing. Those are the kind of things that we don't always think about at the beginning when we're starting up. You might think about them later when you're reviewing your bylaws and maybe looking to amend them. But we often don't think about what's going to happen down the road when our corporation or our nonprofit grows. You know, sometimes you think, oh, well, that we don't need to think about those things. They're not going to happen. There's just, you know, 3 of us starting this up, or maybe there's just 1 person starting it up. And there may be some other things that you can think about when you're just starting out and you maybe aren't going to have a big board. Sometimes people come to us and they're starting a nonprofit, for example, and they've got 2 people in addition to themselves who are willing to be on their board and, you know, help run the corporation from that standpoint, which is great. But you may find later on, as you grow, that you need more than that, and there needs to be some kind of a delineation of, you know, responsibilities and how long people are committed to be an officer or a member of the board of directors. So these are just kind of the general things that you need to think about here. You know, of course, one of the main things is what kind of corporation are you going to have? As I said, you can have membership in your corporation. You can also have one that doesn't have members. So this slide describes a little bit just in general about that. So if it's self-perpetuating, it's really the board of directors that's running things. And so you really need to be thinking about who's going to be on your board of directors and what kind of individuals that you want on the board to be running things for you, because you'll be answerable to that board. If you have a membership organization, that's a little more, slightly more complicated, because you have to think about how you're going to operate vis-a-vis the members. What kind of rights and duties will the members have? You know, how do they come into the corporation and how do they leave? We've noted on this slide the code section on voting requirements. And you'll see that, as Tiffany mentioned earlier, there are a lot of provisions in the code sections that will say, well, unless you provide otherwise in your corporate documents. And as you see here, the bylaws are one of those documents. So this would be the default provision. So you can, kind of change it up, do it the way that you want to do. But, there's not a one-size-fits-all way to do things like this. And that's why it's always important that you consult with a lawyer, even when you're doing your bylaws. Lots of times people will come to us and say, oh, I want to apply to be a 501c3 corporation, but they haven't even, created their bylaws yet. And that's like step one. Sometimes we're in a hurry because you're applying for some sort of IRS exemption that might make your donations that you receive tax deductible and that sort of thing, which is great. Obviously for nonprofits, that's what you're looking for. But you can't be too quick to just jump to the 501c3 application, because one of the things that it must have submitted with it, besides your articles of incorporation, are those bylaws. And the bylaws need to be squared away with the whichever section of the code you're applying for. Typically, what we see here is the 501c3 tax exempt corporation. So when you're choosing your board of directors, and of course you're thinking about whether or not you're self-perpetuating or you have members, because there's a distinction there when it comes to the board of directors. So here's some things to consider. Here's an example of what you have in the code section down below, and you'll note that there, and this is in the Nonprofit Act, that you have to have at least 3 directors for a nonprofit, and that has to be, in accordance with your articles and your bylaws. So that's something to think about right there. That's not one of those that says unless the bylaws provide otherwise. It definitely says it has to consist of 3 or more directors, and you can imagine that that's a good idea to have at least those 3 directors when you have a nonprofit that's going to be serving the public in some way. So things to consider when you're choosing that board of directors. We have a list here, of course. As with all of the information we're giving today, it's not comprehensive. There's no way for us to do that in the short amount of time that we do have today. But here's some thoughts that you need to be considering when you're choosing your board of directors. Make sure you may want to limit their authority a certain amount. You may want to expand it. One of the things that often happens when you don't think about those kind of specifics is that you don't give the board enough power, or you give them too much power. So it often depends on what that statement of purpose is that Tiffany talked about right at the very beginning. What's the purpose of your corporation? And think about these things like a board of directors in those terms. There may be some situations where you need way more than 3 directors. And there may be some situations where 3 is just enough and you don't want any more than that at this point. We'll talk in a little bit about amendments to bylaws, but one of the things that you can do as a corporation grows, maybe you said 3 directors is enough. That's, that we have 3 directors that are willing to be on our board right now, and we think they're, good ones. So let's just go with that. But later on, as you grow, you may determine that, hey, I think we might need more than 3 directors. And that's when, as you grow, you start to review your bylaws and really look at them and say, are these really serving us right now as we have expanded, or maybe our purpose has, changed a little bit or expanded itself. So these are just some things to think about. One of many things that we don't think about when looking to create our bylaws is what if something bad happens. So, you can see here we talk about, well, what happens if there's a vacancy on the board? Well, it's easy to say, okay, here's what we'll do. Here's how we will replace someone, a position on the board. But what if one of your directors needs to be removed for some reason, something bad has happened, and they can't really serve your corporation anymore? Right now, you may not be thinking about that. If you're just now starting out, you've got your 3 directors, you can't imagine that anything would ever go wrong, right? But something could go wrong, and you might need to remove a director. You may change out directors as time goes on. You may expand, whatever. But you got to think about if something bad happens, how do you remove a director? And if you don't have that in your own bylaws, then, as Tiffany mentioned at the very beginning, it's going to revert to whatever the default provision is in the South Carolina Code of Laws. So that's an important thing for you to know. It's an important law that you need to review if you're doing this. Don't just rely, on, oh, well, the attorney will handle that for us. You need to really know the law and think about whether or not you want to change up what the code provisions say if you're allowed to. And you also need to know what those code provisions say if they're restricting or limiting you. So you need to think about how you're electing those officers and directors. And here's just a quick slide reviewing that. If it's not a membership organization, it's the board that elects the officers and directors. That's who is really in charge. If you're a membership organization and you have voting membership, then you need to provide how the members can vote on the board of directors. And that can be, very specific. Because members, when you have a membership organization, they do have rights. Now, meetings, you might think that's really simple, but there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to meetings. Most corporations have to have that annual meeting, but you may also want to have regular meetings, either of the membership or just of the board. It happens quite a bit that things come up in between meetings, certainly in between, that once a year annual meeting, but also if you have regular meetings like once a quarter, for example. Some people have them monthly, some just have them quarterly. But something might come up that really needs to be addressed. And that might be when you need a special meeting. But you need to think about under what circumstances are you going to say that a special meeting is really needed. Now, there's code provision about emergency meetings where you can't get a quorum that you need or something like that. But special meetings are usually for a particular purpose, not because there's an emergency, but for example, you might be trying to buy a piece of property, and there might be something with that situation or that transaction that's time sensitive, and it can't wait for the next meeting. So you have to go ahead and have a special meeting. Right now, a lot of corporations are operating in the before times, before the virus, where meetings were held in person. And maybe they have provisions in their bylaws for virtual meetings. I know a lot do, especially in this day and age, because it's so easy to have them that way. But if you already have bylaws, you're already a corporation that's in existence, you might want to look back at those and make sure that you're following whatever your bylaws say when it comes to meetings, virtual meetings, and the notice of those meetings, requiring minutes to be taken and how they're going to be taken. Those kind of things have become particularly important now that so much of it is being done virtually. So definitely encourage you to think about that. We talked about earlier one example, or Tiffany talked about it, one example of the code sections that govern, well, for example, I think the one that she showed was a nonprofit corporation, and it talks about what is a quorum. And that provision also starts out with, unless your articles or bylaws direct otherwise, then this is what a quorum would be, and this is how the voting would be done. So you definitely can make that your own when it comes to setting up how your corporation is going to operate in the bylaws. You want to determine, make a decision on whether or not you're going to let people vote by proxy. Now if you're creating a way to have virtual meetings and kind of let that be sometimes the rule rather than the exception, then you have to think about to what extent do you really need that proxy. The proxy being one member giving another member the right to cast their vote, and that typically is going to have to be done in writing. But that started out really as a way to allow someone to cast their vote when they couldn't be at a meeting that was in person. And so that's a lot different nowadays. And so you just have to think about how to provide for that for your particular corporation's situation. Okay, I said I would get to amendments. And as Tiffany said at the beginning, it really is important to review your bylaws regularly. In fact, you may even want to go ahead and have a provision in there that says the bylaws will be reviewed at certain intervals. Now, you may not need to do it every year. It could be every 2 years, but it's something that you want to think about doing, because the way things are changing so rapidly in these modern times, it's definitely something that you need to keep an eye on, and you may want to designate a particular corporate officer who is in charge of that annual review, or making sure that that annual review happens. So as we say here, it needs to be specific in the bylaws as to how they can be amended. Sometimes we don't realize that our bylaws need to provide for something in particular in a transaction that we're doing. And so we don't have a provision in the bylaws that covers some particular happenstance. So you may have to go back and actually very quickly amend the bylaws to make sure that that is in there. That's one of those things that happens when people try to hurriedly create some bylaws, and they just use a little form that they get at the store or online, and they think that's going to cover everything. And maybe they're applying for that 501c3, and there's some particular provision that's required to be in your bylaws, and it's not there. So you got to go back and amend those bylaws. So it may be that you want to provide amendments under certain circumstances. Will they always be by all the members if you're a membership organization? Can the board amend the bylaws, and how do they do that? And what does the vote have to be on something like that? So when you're changing the bylaws, quite often you see situations where factions start to happen, and you don't want there to just be one faction that's always creating amendments and not having others being allowed to consider them. So those are some things you need to think about at the beginning, but also as you grow and expand and are reviewing those bylaws and thinking about amendments. And here's just a little section that we included from the nonprofit code about the approval of articles of incorporation and bylaws for you. Okay, one important thing that it's crucial to have addressed in your bylaws, and that is conflicts of interest that may arise. An example of a conflict of interest might be that you have a nonprofit that is buying a piece of land that's owned by a member of the corporation, or maybe a director or officer of the corporation. So there may be some conflict there. You want to make sure that it is a legitimate transaction, that you're paying the right price, or if it's being donated, you want to make sure that all of the parameters that are required there are being done correctly. So when there's interest like that that might be competing, quite often we don't think that they are a conflict or that they are a competing interest, but they can be. And so you need to have something that we call a conflict of interest policy. And many corporations now do have those, but it's important to have them. And it's also important for any officers and directors who are always having to, sign different things and different acknowledgments as an officer or director of a corporation. One of the things that they should be reviewing and signing is that conflict of interest policy, so that if some issue arises, they're not going to be in a position of saying, well, I had no idea that this is, what would happen, or that this is how it would be. Well, if they sign the policy, then they know what that eventuality is and how it's going to be handled. Okay, and this is just one final note as we draw things to a conclusion, and that is just some pitfalls that you need to remember to avoid. I think most of these we've already said throughout the presentation, but of course, review your bylaws regularly. Make sure that everybody is familiar with them, especially the ones that you deal with a lot on an ongoing basis as part of the operation of the corporation. Especially when you're making important decisions, refer to those bylaws. And an example of an important decision would be dealing with a conflict of interest that may arise. Now, another thing, as I think we did mention, and that is you want to be careful that you're not putting too many rules in place and being too specific about things. You do want to allow for some fluidity in a corporation, but that can be very, very tedious and exhausting work when you're creating those bylaws. So again, I like to point these things out because people, sometimes feel like the bylaws are just like a little throwaway issue that just has to be done real quickly so that they can apply for a 501c3. So these are really important things that you need to spend some time thinking about. And again, just the updating and amending, knowing that your bylaws will probably need to be amended from time to time, whether it be we've got some examples here. Maybe there's changes in the law. Maybe there's problems that you didn't anticipate when you drew up your bylaws. It happens. We can't account for every single eventuality. And depending on what kind of work you're doing with your corporation, there's quite often things that are going to be missed and things that you hadn't thought of that would happen with the particular business that you're going to be doing with your corporation, whether it be for-profit or not-for-profit. So as things come up, you're going to want to be able to be flexible and have some amendments. And so think about that when you're making a determination about your rules of how you amend your bylaws. Okay. Well, that is a very quick overview of the basics of bylaws, and really a big part of what we wanted to do today was just make sure that our viewers know how important bylaws really are, and that you should really take some time to think about all the things that can happen. Now, we have a little bit of time to go over some questions, and I'm going to I think we have a few questions, Tiffany, that people submitted in the beginning. Did you want me to go ahead and do those?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the questions that was submitted at registration was how do you move from a nonprofit in South Carolina to a federal nonprofit? And I'm not completely sure what is meant there, but I'm going to assume that this is a corporation that has gotten a nonprofit status in South Carolina, but maybe has not been approved as a 501c3 or some other version of that internal part of the Internal Revenue Code. And so essentially you have to take what you already have as far as your documentation, and you're going to need to review that with a lawyer and make sure that all the way that your corporation is operating, the articles and the bylaws and so forth all comply with what's required in that application. So it's a process, but it's not completely hard to do, but you're definitely going to need the help of a lawyer. The next question that we have was, can I have a for-profit business that offers non-profit services, and how do I set that up? I think if you're looking to apply for grants that are out there for, builders and different things like that, then you definitely have to set that up as a separate entity. There can't be really any intermingling of that. You'd have to be really careful about that. So I would suggest that that be a separate entity But again, that's something that you really do need to get some specific legal advice on based on what kind of company you have now and how that's operating. If you're wanting to, you know, in a separate way, take advantage of some of the opportunities out there with grants and so forth, then you're definitely going to probably need to be a 501c3. Okay, and then finally, the pre-registration or the registration questions. Should the bylaws cover the need for liability insurance, and address how much would be needed? That's definitely really important that the bylaws should cover that. And you need to think about not just consulting with your attorney, but consulting with your insurance agent about what is needed and what's available. Most corporations have insurance for their officers and directors, so that they're not personally held responsible for things that happen with the corporation that they might be sued for or something like that. But then on the other hand, you may have a corporation that is doing events, fundraising events and things like that. And when you do those, obviously, you need liability insurance. So those are just a couple of examples of the kind of insurance that you might need. But we don't really have a laundry list of all that because it's very, there's some general ones like the ones I just mentioned, but there may also be some specific ones that are important for the particular business that you're in. For example, if you're doing some construction with, excuse me, with government grants, there's going to be requirements there. Certainly insurance that you typically would have if you're doing construction and so forth. So there's all kinds of things that you need to think about when it comes to insurance. So, you know, I would review that with attorney and insurance agent. Okay, Tiffany, what else do we have?
Okay, so there are a few questions in the question box. And the first is, can you have members but still allow the board to make decisions?
Yes, is the quick answer to that. You can have members, but again, it has to be in the bylaws how you set that up. You know, to what degree do the members really have a vote? In what situations are you going to allow the members to participate in the decision making of the corporation? And in which ones are you going to want that to be a decision for the board of directors alone? So it can be done, and you just need to think it through, think about the eventualities of, you know, what kind of situations you would want to address when it comes to voting on decisions for the corporation.
Okay, and the last question is, will the slides used in the webinar be available as a PDF handout for the viewers?
It is not made available as a PDF, but I think if I'm not mistaken, if you go to YouTube, you can do it that way. However, if I'm wrong about that and you can't download it in that way from YouTube, which is where we typically post these, I will definitely make a note right now to make sure that we include a link to a PDF when we post it, because we do, when we post to YouTube, we link to all the other resources that we have that might address some of these issues. And I'll just go ahead and mention that we do have this slide that gives all the information about getting in touch with South Carolina Legal Services if you want to have us assist you with these kinds of issues. And, you know, keep in mind, we will help with that, and we will, you know, give the best legal advice that we can, but we can't create your bylaws for you. You have to think about what your needs are. And then as we go through the process of drafting your bylaws, you're the one that's making those determinations. You know, we don't make those determinations for you. We can suggest, we can give examples, but in the long run, it is you, the incorporators or the corporation that's already existing that has to come to us and actually contribute to what we're putting into the bylaws. So if we don't have everything that you need once we post this recording and slides on our YouTube page, definitely get in touch with us. You can apply not only by calling on the telephone, as you see here, but you can also apply online. And that's a wonderful way to do it because you can do it any time of day. And so, quite often we'll have to call you back and go over some specifics. But that way you're in that system, and we'll get with you as soon as we can to start that process. So if there's not any other questions, Tiffany, I will just say thank you to you for joining me today to go through the basics of bylaws with me for our viewers. And I want to also thank all of you who joined us today. We appreciate your interest in this subject and in all the other subjects that we cover in this series. Level Up Law is a series of free legal events, webcasts basically, that educate the public on the type of cases that we see with our clients, things that our clients face. So you can join us every Tuesday at noon right here, and you can find out all about registering on our Facebook page, on our website, which is here. Lawhelp.org/SC is the website where you can find the information about registering for each of our webinars. And then I would just mention that we have, I don't know how many of these now. We started June 9th, but you can go to our YouTube channel. We have a playlist on our YouTube channel that's all of the Level Up Law webcasts that we have done. So there's quite a few with a lot of good information. So check that out and subscribe to the channel and sign up for those notifications. And that way you'll get that notification every time one of these is posted, so that if you weren't able to register and join us, you can at least go back and see that information on the recording with the slides. And of course, for this one today, you need to give us a day or two to get that put up on our YouTube channel, but it will be up there typically by the end of the week. Okay, and just don't forget, if you have a legal issue, here's all the information on the screen for you to sign up or do an online intake or call us to see if we can help you with whatever legal issue you are having. I do want to again remind you that next week on Tuesday at noon, our lead attorney for Veterans Affairs, Corey Strain, out of our Charleston office, will be talking about the latest information that veterans need to know about. So that promises to be a really great presentation, and we look forward to Corey's episode and to a great audience as we have had today. We appreciate all the questions, and feel free to contact us if you have any other questions about this or any other legal topic. So Tiffany, I'm just going to say goodbye to you, and thanks again for your help today. And again, we appreciate everyone who attended, and that concludes our webinar for today. Look forward to having you back with us next week. Thanks, everybody.